In this video, we journey into the shimmering heart of Mesoamerican myth, a world where gods walked beside men, and where divine power came not with peace but with pressure. You will not find the calm Olympus of the Greeks here, nor the symmetrical logic of Roman temples. In the Aztec cosmos, the divine demanded action, constant nourishment, endless ritual, relentless dedication. This is not mythology made for comfort. This is mythology shaped by necessity. A sun that would die without blood. A world that teetered on the edge of chaos every day. In these next hours, we will not only observe the gods, we will live as them, or try to, through the quiet eyes of a priest who wakes to chants and sleepwalks through sacrifice. Through the burning ascent and inevitable exhaustion of Huitzilopochtli, the god who carried the sun on his back. Through the dusty mystery of Quetzalcoatl's vanished cults. And through the gold-laced silence of the Aztec emperor who was a god in name, but a prisoner in ritual. Let this be your slow descent into a world where belief was not only spiritual, it was survival. Welcome to the exhausting glory of Aztec divinity. Imagine this. You wake before the sun, not to admire the first light, but to prevent it from not arriving at all. In your world, the sun is not guaranteed. Its rising depends on action. On your action, your breath, your voice, your blood. You are an Aztec priest, and this is not a metaphor. You believe and are expected to ensure that without your ritual, the great solar god will fail to rise, and the universe may spiral into darkness. So, you move in silence before dawn, your bare feet touching cold stone. The air smells faintly of copal incense, charred from last night's offerings, still lingering in the cracks of the temple's sacred chamber. You haven't eaten, you haven't drunk water, you haven't slept fully in weeks, but none of this matters. The body is secondary to the role. Your position is not one of comfort, power, or leisure, though outsiders might assume otherwise. It is a position of relentless pressure. The calendar guides you. It's not just a series of dates, but a cosmic map. Each day aligns with a deity, each action with a necessity. Miss one, forget one, and the fabric of order begins to unravel. And so, you chant. Not once, not 10 times, but for hours. Your voice a low drone, unchanging, carved into you by repetition. Your words are not improvised. They have been passed down precisely, syllable by syllable, from priest to priest. The gods do not tolerate invention. They tolerate accuracy. You must recall not only the tone, but the exact pronunciation. One misplaced breath, one slip of the tongue, and the ritual must begin again. The gods are old, and they are not forgiving. After the chanting comes the offering. And while some days it is maize or incense, other days demand more. Not symbolic offerings, real ones, living ones. The sacrificial knife you hold has a name. It has a spirit. It has history. It was wielded by the priest before you, and will be wielded by the priest after you. If you last, its blade is sharp, but the responsibility is sharper. You do not choose who is sacrificed. That decision belongs to those higher than you. But you must perform the act, cleanly, precisely. With reverence, you have been trained not just in theology, but in anatomy. You know how to hold the chest, how to split the skin, how to extract the heart still warm and pulsing. Quickly, quietly, respectfully. The body is placed on the stone. For attendants, hold the limbs. You whisper a prayer. You raise the blade. You do what must be done. And then, just as quickly, the ritual continues. The heart is offered, lifted toward the sky, held before the sun as it rises. Or perhaps because it rises. It is not symbolic. It is not hypothetical. It is required. You do not feel like a murderer. You do not feel like a savior. You feel like a vessel, like an extension of the divine machinery. You are not exempt from fear. But you are trained not to let it show. Later, you cleanse. Not just your hands, but your soul. You burn herbs. You recite more chants. You do not weep, even when the chosen one was young. You do not question. You have no room for doubt. Doubt is an opening. Doubt is a crack, and cracks let in chaos. There is a kind of fatigue that is not physical. You feel it now. The exhaustion of vigilance, the endless awareness, the knowledge that every ritual, every word, every motion must be correct, or the world might tremble. The gods are not passive. They listen, they test, they sometimes punish. You've seen crops fail after an offering was delayed. You've seen plagues rise after a misaligned ceremony, or so you believe. And in that belief is your prison and your purpose. Midday brings brief respite. You sit on cool stone, not in comfort, but in readiness. Your robes are stained, but you cannot change yet. The next ceremony approaches. This one honors the rain god, Tlaloc, and it is gentler, or appears to be, but it requires children. They must cry. Their tears are sacred. They are necessary. And so, you prepare. You instruct the younger priests on what to say, how to calm them, how to guide them to the altar. You watch them struggle, their hands trembling slightly. You remember your first time. You say nothing. You observe. The ritual proceeds. The tears are collected. The prayers are offered. The rain will come. You hope. Evening falls. The sun sets. Not because of you, but because you followed the script, and so you breathe. Just a little, not in relief, but in momentary pause. Tomorrow will bring new gods, new rituals, new demands. And you will rise again before the light, before the city stirs, before your thoughts can form. The role has consumed you. You no longer ask why, you only ask what is next. The life of an Aztec priest is not one of serenity. It is one of service, of burden, of belief so complete it erases individuality. You are not a man. You are a mouth, a hand, a heart that beats in rhythm with the gods, or is torn out when it no longer serves. The temple never sleeps, even when the city quiets, even when the last market stall is shuttered and the moon casts pale light over stone streets. There is movement within the walls of the sacred precinct. You, the priest, do not belong to day or night. You belong to the cycle, to the rhythm. Time bends around the calendar of the gods, and you move through it like a thread drawn taut. Tonight, you are not preparing a major festival, but the observance of a lesser-known deity, one whose favor is still vital. Perhaps it is Huitzilopochtli, the flayed god of renewal, whose rites demand skins. Not simply in metaphor, but in worn, real garments. You pass others in the temple, scribes, lower priests, apprentices, and none greet you. Words are rationed. Silence is sacred. Every sound is a ripple in the spiritual stillness. You reach the storeroom. Shelves carved from cedar hold rows of offerings. Dried maize, woven flowers, beads shaped like stars. You select each with purpose. Each item is inscribed with meaning. You do not choose them for their beauty, but for their alignment. To present the wrong offering is to offend. To offend is to risk. The gods are listening, always. Outside the chamber, the scent of night flowers mingles with a faint trace of blood. Not because the temple is unclean, far from it, but because blood is present in nearly every sacred act. Not as gore, as essence, as proof of sincerity. You prepare the altar. Not a grand one, not in the central plaza, but a modest shrine nestled into a corner where three walls meet. The god it honors is old. Older than the empire, older than your lineage, perhaps even older than memory itself. The offering must begin at a precise moment, not by the clock, but by the position of stars, the breath of wind, the exact tone of silence. You wait, you watch, you feel, and then, without command, you begin. You light the torch, you place the offering, You bow 3 times. Slowly, you chant. Not loud, not soft, but steady. The melody is circular, spiraling back on itself, looping like time. You feel your own body disappear into the ritual. Your hands move, but you are not commanding them. They are responding. This, you think, must be what the gods want. Not invention, not performance, but precision. The ritual ends. No sign follows. No thunder, no whisper, no transformation. Only silence again, and you are satisfied. Not because something changed, but because nothing faltered. Later, you return to your quarters. Spartan stone. No bed, only woven mats. No light, only a narrow slit through which the moon barely reaches. You remove your robe slowly, folding it with care. Even in solitude, form matters. You eat maize cakes, cold, unseasoned. Not for pleasure, but to sustain the body that sustains the ritual. You lie down, not to sleep, but to rest. Sleep, when it comes, is brief and shallow. You dream of smoke, of hearts held high, of drums in distant plazas. When you wake, you cannot tell whether the dream was memory or prophecy. Morning arrives again, as always, with the soft steps of a novice lighting incense in the hallway. You rise. There is no resistance. The body remembers. The mind follows. Today is a feast day, a major one. The entire city will participate. The nobles will parade in embroidered garments, the warriors will dance, the merchants will decorate their stalls. But you will not celebrate. You will serve. The ceremony begins at mid-morning, and your role today is to oversee the blessing of the sacrificial captives. These are not criminals. These are not slaves. They are offerings, honored, anointed, prepared. Some came willingly. Others did not. All are treated with the same ritual care. You anoint their foreheads with ochre. You tie feathers into their hair. You speak to them, not as a man, but as a conduit. You tell them what awaits. You do not lie. You do not soften. You do not dramatize. You simply state, you are a gift. You are necessary. You are eternal. Some meet your gaze. Some look away. Some weep. You do not judge. You do not comfort. You prepare. In the great square, a crowd gathers. They sing, they cheer. But the priests remain solemn. To them, this is not entertainment. It is function. It is survival. The offering must be perfect. The gods must be pleased. The sun must rise again. You perform the rites with practiced grace. The knife shines. The chants rise. The heart is lifted. The ashes are collected, and through it all, you feel not elation, not sorrow, but focus. The kind of focus that transcends emotion, that becomes presence, that becomes necessity. The day continues. Ritual follows ritual. You change garments. You purify again. You instruct the younger priests. You bless the tools. You eat briefly. You continue. The city sleeps. You do not. The rhythm calls. The cycle turns. The gods wait, and you always answer. As the third day of this festival cycle arrives, your bones ache, but not in protest. They simply remember. The steps up the pyramid are familiar now, their rough stone edges pressing into your feet with each measured climb. You ascend without thought, because thought would only distract from precision. Each movement is prescribed. Your body obeys. Behind you, a line of junior acolytes follows, bearing woven baskets of offerings. Cacao, feathers, jade fragments, and dried chilies, each aligned with a god, each representing a facet of the universe that must remain in balance. Balance is your obsession, not comfort, not meaning, just ... balance. At the summit, the city lies beneath you, a patchwork of stone and red and motion. But you do not gaze out over the beauty. You turn inward, facing the altar where the sky meets expectation. You raise your hands, not to beckon, but to mirror. The sun is already there, blazing overhead. You acknowledge it, not as a giver of life, but as a recipient of duty. Today's god is Tonatiuh, the sun itself, not merely a symbol, but an engine requiring nourishment. You are not here to praise, you are here to feed. The ritual begins. Your hands, though steady, feel the weight of the blade. This is your third sacrifice in 3 days. Each one required, each one recorded, each one observed by silent gods and murmuring mortals alike. The first chant begins low, the syllables ancient, pre-Aztec. A language older than the city, passed from tongue to tongue, preserved not in books, but in breath. You repeat it, your voice neither loud nor soft, only correct. Accuracy is holiness. As the offering approaches, escorted by 4 assistants, you meet his eyes. He is painted blue, the color of sacrifice. His wrists are adorned with paper streamers. His expression is distant. Perhaps he has entered that suspended state the older priests speak of. When the mind detaches, floats, becomes ritual itself. You do not pause, you act. The knife glints, the motion is practiced. The heart is raised, the people cheer. But you do not flinch. You do not bow. You do not absorb their energy. You return to the altar. You clean the blade. You whisper the final words. You descend the steps, and you begin the next rite. Later, you assist in the fire ceremony, not to summon fire, but to extinguish and relight the sacred flame that keeps the world ordered. Every fire in the city has been put out, or hearth cold. And now, with precise movements, you kindle the new fire on the temple's heart, using wood, breath, and belief. As the spark catches, you feel a moment of pause. Not emotion, not victory, but alignment. This is what the world needs. Continuation. The sacred fire is carried down into the city, where it will reignite every home, every corner. Life resumes. You, however, remain at the summit, resting only in posture, never in vigilance. That night, the temple is quiet again, but your mind is loud. Not with thoughts, but with echoes, chants, footsteps, heartbeats. You record the day's rituals in bark paper codices, inked with obsidian and soot. You do not interpret, you document. Interpretation is dangerous. It leads to invention. An invention has no place in cosmic precision. The gods did not ask for creativity. They asked for constancy. You lie down once more, the mat beneath you thin, the walls around you echoing with generations. You sleep in the same chamber as those who came before you. Their names etched into stone. Their stories spoken in ceremonies. You wonder, will your name be etched too? Or will your accuracy make you anonymous? Either way, it does not matter. You were never in this for self. You were a part. A breath, a link in a chain. And tomorrow, the gods will expect you again. By the time the moon has begun its slow retreat toward the western hills, the city of Tenochtitlan stirs again, and you, despite the wear of uncountable days, rise once more to take your place among the sacred machinery. There is no alarm, no summons. You simply awaken, as if the temple itself breathes you to life. The woven mat leaves its imprint on your skin, and the air is still thick with incense that never fully fades. This day begins not with blood, but with breath. You are to lead the morning invocation to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of wind, learning, and mourning. His rites are quieter, more reflective, but no less exacting. You cleanse your body in cold water, a ritual meant to humble, not refresh. You dress in the white robes stitched with turquoise and shell. You do not speak as you walk the long corridor of the priest's quarters. Speech is reserved for the divine. The temple courtyard glows with early light, and you stand alone in its center. A conch shell is blown. The sound, deep and ancient, reverberates through the open space like the voice of time itself. Then you begin the prayer. The words are soft, slow, each one placed with care, as though setting stones in a path that leads beyond this world. You do not look upward. The gods are not in the sky. They are in the structure, in the wind, in the silence between syllables. As your voice drifts across the stones, other priests join, staggered, layered, until the air is filled with a lattice of devotion. This harmony is not musical. It is mathematical, ritual math, sacred symmetry. The prayer ends not in crescendo, but in stillness. And stillness is the holiest of conclusions. Today, you are assigned a different duty, instructing acolytes. These young men, boys, some of them, have arrived from all corners of the empire, nobles and commoners alike. They wear simple garments. They do not speak unless addressed. Their heads are shaved, their eyes wide. You remember being one of them. Before the weight, before the precision. You do not speak to them with warmth. You speak with purpose. You teach them the first 20 signs of the ritual calendar. You show them how to grind pigments for glyphs. You recite the first chant of the maize god cycle, not once, but 17 times, until they can repeat it without error. You do not praise, you do not scold. You correct, calmly, sharply. They will not all survive this path. Some will return to their villages. Others will falter. A few will ascend. But all must be perfect while they remain. Perfection, after all, is not excellence. It is expectation. That evening, a ceremony of penance is held, not for the people, for the priests. You and your peers gather in the lower temple, where torches burn low and the smell of herbs smolders in clay bowls. Each of you takes a thin obsidian blade. Each of you draws a line across your own skin, forearm, thigh, tongue. The blood is not for show, it is for humility. It reminds you that you are not above sacrifice. You are only a practitioner of it. The gods must see you bleed. Only then will they trust you to take blood from others. The pain is sharp, clean, temporary. It does not define you, it refines you. You leave the ceremony limping slightly, but with no complaint. Pain is a form of alignment. That night, as the city sleeps, you are called to the inner sanctum. A rare occurrence. Only the high priest enters regularly. But tonight, he summons you. You bow low, he speaks little. He gestures to a codex laid out on the altar, ancient, thick with glyphs. It is a new sequence, a ritual uncovered from older times before Tenochtitlan, before even Teotihuacan. You are to memorize it, master it, and perform it in 2 days' time for a visiting delegation from the southern provinces. There is no room for misstep. This ritual, long dormant, must be reborn in full form. You spend the night studying. You trace each glyph with your finger. You whisper each phrase into the stone. You do not sleep. Sleep is a luxury reserved for those outside the rhythm. You, however, are the rhythm. By the following day, the codex's symbols no longer feel foreign to your tongue. You've repeated the chants so many times, they now echo inside your breath, even when you're silent. You have no memory of your last full meal. Your stomach is quiet, obedient. Hunger has become background noise, a familiar hum beneath the chants and footfalls. Today's ritual is to take place in the inner temple courtyard, a space rarely seen by commoners. Surrounded by high stone walls, etched with the faces of gods both celebrated and obscure. You arrive before dawn. You wear robes dyed with cochineal, so deep red they seem nearly black in shadow. The altar has been prepared by lower priests. You inspect it, not as a skeptic, but as a final layer of precision. One misplaced bowl, one crooked stone, and the entire ritual could be nullified. Cosmic errors are not forgiven. They are simply absorbed, compounded, carried forward in consequence. As the sun begins its ascent, the guests arrive. Nobles from the distant Mixtec region adorned with gold and turquoise. Their eyes scan the temple's every line. You do not look at them. You are not here to impress. You are here to perform. The high priest gives the sign. The ritual begins. Your voice rises first, drawing out the slow, spiraling introduction that calls the gods' attention. Then others join, layering chants and intervals, building a sonic architecture of memory and presence. You move to the center. Raise your arms. Draw the sacred spiral with your feet on the stone. Your gestures are not invented. They are inherited, precise, encoded in muscle memory and myth. You perform the offering, not blood, not this time, but obsidian dust mixed with cacao and crushed maize, a symbolic meal meant to nourish the god in metaphor. You scatter it in a circle, clockwise, 4 times, north, east, south, west. The air hums with a stillness that is not silence. It is anticipation. The chant peaks. You kneel. You whisper the final word. And then, stillness again. There is no sign of divine approval. There never is. That is not your concern. The ritual has been executed without flaw. That is all that matters. Later, the delegation thanks the high priest. You receive no acknowledgement, and you expect none. Your role is not glory, it is guardianship. You return to your chambers. You wash your hands until the pigment runs clear. You place the codex back in its wrapping, fold the cloth precisely, and return it to the stone shelf where it will sleep until summoned again. As you lie down, exhaustion wraps you not in pain, but in stillness. You do not feel triumphant, you feel empty. And that, you realize, is the goal. The best priests are not full of themselves. They are vessels. The next morning, you are awakened by a novice, barely older than a child. He brings word from the outer precinct. A famine is brewing in a nearby region. The crops have withered early. The rains are late. The people are afraid. The gods, they say, are displeased. And so the calendar must be adjusted. A drought ritual, usually performed only once every 5 years, must be moved forward. You are tasked with leading its preparation. That evening, you travel to the edge of the city, not to the central temple, but to a smaller shrine dedicated to Tlaloc, god of rain. It sits beside a canal, choked with dry reeds. The land here is parched, cracked. The people have already begun fasting. They await relief. You walk the perimeter of the shrine. You examine the glyphs. You count the stones. Everything must be perfect. This ritual is not simply symbolic. If the rains do not return, people will starve. You feel the pressure not as fear, but as weight. The familiar weight of continuity. You sleep beside the canal that night, beneath a mat of woven reeds. The stars above are dim. Even the sky is withholding. At dawn, you rise and begin the offering. A child has been chosen. Young, innocent, unblemished. He is weeping. Not from fear, perhaps, but from the cold. Tlaloc requires tears. Tears are sacred. Tears summon rain. You touch the child's forehead. You whisper. You anoint. You do not think. You do not hesitate. You serve. The ritual proceeds. The chants are lower here, more guttural. The air is thick with smoke from burning copal. As the offering is made, clouds begin to gather. Or perhaps they always were. No one speaks of coincidence. All is pattern. All is cause. By midday, a fine mist begins to fall. The people weep. Not for the offering, for the rain. You return to the temple hours later, soaked not from storm, but from expectation fulfilled. The gods have answered, or so it seems. That night you are finally permitted to rest, a true rest. No rituals, no chants. Just sleep. But even in dreams, you hear the drumbeat of duty. You wake before dawn. You rise again, because that is what priests do. they rise. The days blend together. There is no weekend, no Sabbath, no reprieve. Only rotation of duties, of gods, of ceremonies that loop like seasons in an eternal sacred spiral. This week, it is Huitzilopochtli. Next, it will be Zip-Totec. The following, perhaps, Coyolxauhqui. Each god requires different rites, different chants, different regalia, but the rhythm remains. You are awakened before the stars dim. You stretch limbs that no longer ache in protest, but simply continue. Acolytes whisper as you pass. Some avert their gaze, unsure if reverence or fear is more appropriate. You offer no instruction, only demonstration. To teach is to perform. You lead a morning chant on the temple roof, the city still wrapped in night's chill. You draw a circle in the soot-covered tiles with a feather, then erase it, reminding the listeners, gods are cycles. Even creation must dissolve. Later, a ritual cleansing takes place. Not of people, but of objects. You and your fellow priests purify the idols in the Western sanctum. They are removed from their platforms, carried with covered eyes. Not to shield them, but to shield yourselves. Their gaze is too potent to knowing. You wash them with water infused with marigold and crushed jade. You whisper blessings older than the city. You return each statue to its altar, rotated slightly, a reminder that nothing ever returns exactly the same. That afternoon, as the market swells with color and barter, you are secluded in a chamber of silence. You copy glyphs from a crumbling codex into fresh bark paper, your strokes careful, your ink running thin. These are the flood myths, how the gods tried again and again to create humanity, and how each time their designs failed. Bone men, mud people, talking animals. Only after many cycles did the gods settle on flesh. Even the gods, it seems, must learn by repetition. This comforts you. You are not alone in your striving. That evening, a rare event, a lunar eclipse. The temple bells are struck in slow rhythm. The people are frightened. To them, the moon's disappearance is a warning, a jaguar in the sky. To you, it is a rehearsal. You have prepared the chants. You know the offerings. You move through the courtyard with calm precision. You scatter maize flour. You light the cedar branches. You recite the invocation of returning light. And when the moon emerges again, slowly, carefully, the people cheer. But you feel no triumph, only the soft return of expectation. The god has reappeared. Now you must keep him. You sleep late that night. A rare indulgence, but your dreams are not of rest. They are of glyphs that move, of stairs that climb forever, of gods who speak in riddles and vanish before you can answer. In the morning, you wake to another child acolyte knocking gently at your chamber. He carries a bowl of cacao and a scroll. The high priest has summoned you. A new ritual is forming. Something large. Something for the entire empire. There will be days of planning. Nights of rehearsal, dozens of sacrifices. You nod without question. You begin to rise. And as your feet touch the cold stone, you feel the full weight of your role. Not as burden, but as rhythm. You are not tired. You are tuned. You walk the corridor, the same corridor you've walked for years. But today, it feels longer. Or perhaps you have become smaller. Either way, the temple walls press in like memory, and still you walk toward the altar, toward the gods, toward the endless, exhausting, exquisite duty of keeping the world alive, one ritual at a time. In this segment, we shift from the quiet precision of ritual to the mythological heart of empire. At the center of Aztec cosmology stood a god who was not born gently, did not rise gradually, and certainly never rested. Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun, god of war, god of sacrifice, emerged fully formed and fully armed from his mother's womb to wage cosmic battle. His story was not merely a myth, it was a mandate, a justification, a worldview. Through his tale, the Mexica justified conquest, ritual warfare, and the spilling of blood to keep the sun in motion. But behind this divine theater lies something deeper, a portrait of struggle, of myth fused with state building, of power dressed in feathers and obsidian. This is not just a story of gods. It is a story of memory, empire, and narrative control. In this narrative, Huitzilopochtli is both the blade and the banner, a god whose very origin is violence, whose every day requires fuel, whose temples must echo with heartbeat and chant lest the cosmos fall apart. But what kind of god demands this? And what kind of people become architects of such belief? In the following blocks, we'll explore Huitzilopochtli's bloody birth and his place in the Aztec pantheon, the slow and deliberate weaving of his myth into the founding story of Tenochtitlan, and the way his legacy carved not just stone temples, but political structure, calendrical systems, and the very rhythm of imperial life. This is the biography of a god forged for an empire, a being whose hunger mirrored ambition, a deity made not to console, but to conquer. Let us begin. Long before the pyramids of Tenochtitlan pierced the sky, long before obsidian blades flashed in the sacred courtyards, and even before the Mexica called themselves Aztecs, there was a mountain, Coatepec, the Serpent Hill, a place wrapped in myth, but also in purpose. It was here, the stories say, that Huitzilopochtli was born, not with a cry, not with weakness, but with vengeance in hand. His mother, Coatlicue, had become pregnant by mysterious means. Some say a ball of hummingbird. Feathers drifted from the heavens and landed upon her as she swept the temple. This miraculous conception enraged her other children. 400 sons, the Sensan Huitznahu, and one daughter, Coyolxauhqui, the moon. They were ashamed, perhaps, or threatened, or driven by some forgotten law of celestial honor. Whatever the reason, they conspired to kill her before she could give birth. But inside Coatlicue's womb, something stirred, something fully formed, something already divine. And at the moment of betrayal, Huitzilopochtli emerged. Armed, armored, radiant, he grasped a serpent-shaped xucatl, a mythic fire weapon, and in a blaze of violence, he struck down his sister. Her head, it is said, became the moon. Her brothers fled, scattered into the sky. Thus began not just the myth of a god, but the foundational rhythm of Aztec cosmology. The sun, each day, must battle the darkness. It must slay the moon, scatter the stars, and rise in blood. Huitzilopochtli was not a creator god. He did not shape the world from clay or sing life into existence. He maintained it, with effort, with fury, with sacrifice. He was not gentle. He was necessary. And so, the Mexica, the wandering tribe who would one day build an empire, adopted him not only as a patron, but as a mirror. Their migration, their struggle, their search for a home was said to be guided by him, a hummingbird in the sky, a voice in the reeds. They followed him across mountains and valleys, through hostile territories and foreign tongues. And eventually, they came to a swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Here, they saw the omen, an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent. This was the sign foretold by their god. This would be Tenochtitlan, a city born from prophecy, balanced between water and sky, between ritual and war. But cities do not rise from symbols alone. They rise from belief, deep, disciplined, designed belief. And so, the story of Huitzilopochtli had to become more than legend. It had to become law. The Mexica wove his myth into every layer of society. The calendar was shaped in his image. The festival of Huitzilopochtli, a celebration held in his honor, required the sacrifice of captives, their hearts torn from their chests as offerings to keep the sun in motion. His temple atop the Templo Mayor stood alongside that of Tlaloc, war and rain. Side by side, as if to say, without conquest, there is no sustenance. Without blood, there is no balance. Huitzilopochtli was more than a god. He was a schedule, a hunger, a flame that never stopped consuming. And the people fed him day after day, year after year, body after body. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was cosmic maintenance. The Mexica saw the universe as fragile, perpetually on the brink of collapse. It was only through sacrifice, through ritual warfare, that balance could be preserved. And Huitzilopochtli, ever watchful, ever demanding, stood at the center of that balance. Not as a judge, but as an engine. The empire grew, and with it, so did his cult. Entire provinces were taxed not in gold, but in blood. The Flower Wars, ritualized conflicts fought to capture sacrificial victims, were conducted under his banner. Warriors dreamed not of spoils, but of offerings. To die in battle, under his gaze, was to be reborn as a hummingbird, flitting through the sun's garden. Even architecture bowed to his myth. The Templo Mayor was reconstructed multiple times, each layer built over the last like sedimentary memory. And always, Huitzilopochtli's shrine stood on the southern side, the direction of the sun's zenith. His imagery adorned shields, murals, pottery. He was shown as blue-skinned, hummingbird-helmeted, serpent-wielding. A god of movement, a god of fire, a god of force. And yet, for all his violence, there is something tragic in his myth. He was born in response to betrayal. His existence was forged in defense, not domination. He never rests, never pauses. Each morning he rises only to fight again, not because he chooses to, but because he must. He is duty, crystallized into divinity. He is struggle, made sacred. And in that, perhaps, he reflects not just the Mexica, but all of us. Always climbing, always fighting, always burning just to stay alight. To understand how Huitzilopochtli's myth transformed into imperial mandate, one must step into the minds of the Mexica not as distant historians, but as believers embedded in their world. Picture a priest high upon the Templo Mayor, gazing down not just at a bustling city, but at a living diagram of the cosmos. Every canal, every market stall, every shrine mirrored a cosmic order. The city was a microcosm, the very belly of the world, and at its heart stood Huitzilopochtli's temple, perpetually soaked in the echoes of ritual, sacrifice, and the slow chant of continuity. He was not a decorative deity, not one of many to choose from for comfort or luck. He was the very justification of the Mexica Empire, a divine force whose hunger explained conquest, whose myth explained expansion, whose expectations required offerings not only of prayer, but of captives, labor, and life. This transformation of myth into political engine was no accident. The priesthood, which served both as spiritual authority and administrative power, deliberately elevated Huitzilopochtli's cult during the height of Mexica's state building. His name appeared more frequently in codices. His festivals gained prominence. His iconography became more centralized, more aggressive. He was no longer just the god of a wandering tribe. He had become the god of an empire. But to rule an empire, even in myth, a god must have a history, a past that justifies the present. And so, new stories emerged, crafted with care, told in ceremony and codex alike. One such story detailed how Huitzilopochtli guided the Mexica through their long migration, appearing in visions, demanding temples at key stops, selecting rulers through signs. He became a shepherd of destiny, his voice instructing the people when to move, when to stay, when to fight. These stories legitimized not only past actions, but present hierarchies. If Huitzilopochtli had chosen this land, this city, these rulers, then all was as it should be. Disobedience became heresy. Rebellion, sacrilege. Even the founding of Tenochtitlan was retroactively saturated in his image. The omen of the eagle on the cactus, originally a sign from the broader pantheon, became his alone. He had sent the eagle. He had whispered to the priests. He had ordained the conquest of the valley. And from this foundation myth, the empire grew, not just outward, but inward. Social structures bent around his logic. Warriors who captured the most prisoners for sacrifice rose in rank. Nobles traced their lineage to companions of the wandering Mexica, blessed by Huitzilopochtli's favor. Markets operated on calendars that aligned with his festivals. Even marriage and childbirth rituals were infused with references to his myth, reminding citizens at every stage of life that the sun est survival, and thus their own, depended on loyalty, discipline, and the perpetuation of sacrifice. Yet for all its strength, this structure had a cost. It required constant maintenance, not just in rituals and warfare, but in belief. The people had to believe that their God truly needed them, that their offerings truly sustained the sun, that without them the universe would collapse into night. Doubt was dangerous, dissent even deadlier. And so the priesthood worked tirelessly to reaffirm the myth. During Huitzilopochtli, effigies of Huitzilopochtli, made of amaranth dough and honey, were paraded through the streets, then ceremonially eaten by the people, a ritual of divine consumption and renewal. Captives were dressed as the god, their bodies painted, their actions choreographed to reflect his myth. They were both honored and doomed, avatars of the god's hunger. The sun, meanwhile, continued its path, and each dawn was both victory and warning. It had risen, but would it tomorrow? Only if the proper rites were observed, only if the right blood was spilled. The empire lived in this loop, a daily drama of cosmic maintenance with Huitzilopochtli as its ever-demanding centerpiece. It is important to note that Huitzilopochtli was not always embraced with warmth. He was feared as much as loved. His temple approached with awe, not intimacy. Unlike gods of fertility or music, he did not bring pleasure or abundance. He brought purpose, relentless, scorching, unyielding. He asked not for gratitude, but for service. And in that service, the people found structure, meaning, and perhaps a kind of grim comfort. There was no ambiguity. The sun must rise. The blood must flow. The god must be fed. And so the city pulsed, day after day, in rhythm with this theology of necessity. For foreign visitors, this system could seem monstrous. Spanish chroniclers wrote with horror about the sacrifices, the towers of skulls, the rivers of blood. But what they failed to grasp, or chose to ignore, was the underlying logic. For the Mexica, the world was precarious. Life was a borrowed thing. And Huitzilopochtli, for all his violence, was a stabilizer. A god who, like the people who followed him, was born under siege, forced to act, bound to duty. His myth, then, was not one of domination for its own sake. It was about survival. Cosmic, cultural, existential. And through that lens, the feathered war was not merely bloodshed. It was sacrifice rendered sacred. It was empire as liturgy. It was belief, weaponized and worshipped. As the empire matured and Tenochtitlan streets grew wider, its markets busier, and its temples more ornate, the weight of sustaining Huitzilopochtli's presence did not lessen. It deepened. The Templo Mayor was rebuilt several times during the reigns of successive Tlatoani, each reconstruction larger, higher, more precise in its orientation toward celestial alignments. These reconstructions were not merely architectural endeavors, but theological renewals, reassertions of divine favor, re-anchoring the city at the very navel of the cosmos. Each time the temple was built higher, the people were reminded that the sun's ascent, and their own, required ceaseless effort. Atop the temple, two shrines stood side by side, one for Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility, and one for Huitzilopochtli, god of sun and war. Together, they symbolize the dual necessities of life, nourishment and defense, growth and protection. Yet it was Huitzilopochtli's shrine that cast the longer shadow, quite literally in the architecture and metaphorically in the collective consciousness of the empire. Rituals were structured around his myth. Ceremonial processions often included captives destined for sacrifice, marched through the city, their bodies painted, their eyes hollowed by dread or resignation. The people watched, not with casual curiosity, but with solemn necessity. They were not witnessing cruelty. They were participating in salvation. The rituals were elaborate. Priests ascended the steep steps of the Templo Mayor to deliver their offerings, not just of flesh and blood, but of precise, rehearsed ceremony. Each motion, each chant, each drumbeat was part of a liturgical script older than memory. The sacrifice was not a moment of horror, but a culmination, an act as expected and regulated as the turning of a calendar page. Even the tools used were symbolic. Obsidian blades, sharp as thought and just as cold, were sacred. They shimmered like midnight, chosen not for efficiency, but for meaning. Obsidian, volcanic glass, was forged in fire, as was Huitzilopochtli, god of sun and battle. The symbolism repeated itself endlessly in Aztec thought. Nothing was random. Everything reflected back toward the god. And in return, the sun continued to rise. But there were whispers, too. Not everyone saw this order as eternal. Some questioned, quietly, in marketplaces and courtyards, especially in the outer provinces, far from the ceremonial heart of Tenochtitlan. There were those who found the rituals alien, oppressive, disconnected from their own local gods. Rebellions were rare but real. And when they came, the priesthood responded not with negotiation, but with reaffirmation, doubling down on rituals, increasing the grandeur of sacrifice, staging festivals that reaffirmed the central myth of Huitzilopochtli's indispensable role in the cosmos. For those within the empire's core, belief was not just encouraged, it was baked into every aspect of life. Children learned of Huitzilopochtli from their first lessons, not merely as a god, but as a model. Be fierce, be vigilant, be prepared to fight. He was the hummingbird warrior, a paradox of beauty and brutality. And in many ways, the Mexica took that paradox to heart. Their art, their dress, their diplomacy all bore the same blend. Ornate yet deadly, graceful yet governed by a hard-edged practicality. Foreign emissaries to the city, such as the Spanish chroniclers and later friars, often noted how orderly and clean Tenochtitlan was, how its markets overflowed with goods, how its canals rivaled those of Venice. But they also recoiled at the temples, the rituals, the sounds that drifted down from the shrines. Drums, flutes, chanting, and sometimes the echoing cries of sacrifice. What they misunderstood, often deliberately, was that these were not two worlds, the civil and the savage, but one seamless system, a society built entirely around sustaining its god. And that god, in turn, was not cruel, but necessary. The sun did not rise without blood. The crops did not grow without war. Civilization itself, in the Aztec worldview, is not maintained by peace. It was carved out of chaos, moment by moment, by will and ritual. And at the center of that will stood Huitzilopochtli. His temples, his myths, his festivals, his priests, all were cogs in a divine mechanism. The people played their part, not with passive acceptance, but active participation. Festivals such as Tlaquixopialistli and Toxcatl involved the entire city. Mock battles, symbolic offerings, races, singing competitions. These were not distractions from the myth, but extensions of it. Every citizen, in some way, helped turn the gears of the sun. And through it all, Huitzilopochtli remained distant, abstract, immense. Unlike gods of the hearth or harvest, he did not draw near. He did not smile. He demanded, and the people responded. His temple was not a home, it was a furnace, a place where meaning was burned into memory through smoke and chant and blood. But he was not without tenderness, in a way. Huitzilopochtli promised transformation. Those who died in his service, especially warriors, were said to be reborn as birds, hummingbirds, butterflies, creatures of flight and color. It was a vision of the afterlife, not as rest, but as beauty. Constant motion, like the sun itself. To serve Huitzilopochtli was to never be still, in life or death. And perhaps therein lies the essence of the feathered war. It was not merely a tale of conquest or ritual. It was a worldview, a way of organizing life around effort, around struggle, around the sacred act of motion. The sun moves, so must we. Huitzilopochtli does not sleep, so we must remain vigilant. In this way, his myth became the empire's spine, rigid, central, unbreakable. As we follow the rise of Huitzilopochtli into the core of Mexica society, one cannot overlook how deeply embedded this god became in the very machinery of statecraft. Religion and governance were never separate spheres in Tenochtitlan. Instead, they were braided together like the colored cords used in ritual attire. Each strand a different function. Each not a deliberate act of unity between divine will and human law. The Tlatoani, the ruler of the empire, was not merely a political figure. He was chosen through signs from the gods, confirmed by omens, and advised by priests trained in both theology and astronomy. His legitimacy depended on his ability to please Huitzilopochtli, not only through personal piety, but by ensuring a steady flow of captives, sacrifices, and temples dedicated in the god's honor. In this sense, political expansion was religious necessity. Every war waged by the Mexica could be seen as a holy war, not for land or gold, but to fulfill the god's needs. Tribute in the form of exotic feathers, rare stones, and above all, human captives, was understood not as greed, but as obligation. The solar engine needed fuel. The god must be honored. And the people, especially those at the heart of the empire, believed it. They believed because every sunrise confirmed it. Every good harvest reinforced it. Every successful military campaign recoded it. And even when drought came, or disease spread, or rebellion flickered, the failure was not attributed to the god, but to the people as failure to fulfill their duties to him. This belief system, tight, unyielding, ritualized, formed a kind of social contract. The empire will expand. The god will be fed. The sun will rise. Everyone had a role to play, and those roles were reified in festival, in schooling, in trade. A child learned about Huitzilopochtli not only in temple school, but in the home, where toys and lullabies carried references to his birth and battles. Warriors wore hummingbird feathers on their backs and painted their faces with stripes mimicking the god's blue war paint. Even stonemasons and builders carved glyphs into their work that honored the god's eye, his flaming serpent weapon, his solar disk. It was omnipresent, not in an oppressive way, but in a saturating one, like humidity that clings to the skin. And still, Huitzilopochtli's myth adapted. As the empire encountered other peoples and cultures in the Valley of Mexico and beyond, his image absorbed elements from their local deities. In some provinces, he took on more rain-like features. In others, his feathers became brighter, his symbols more hybridized. This syncretism was not seen as dilution, but as dominance. Huitzilopochtli absorbing lesser gods, converting them by subsumption. This furthered the impression of his vastness, his inevitability. He was not just a war god, he was the war god, the god of sun, of sacrifice, of state, of destiny. And as his domain expanded, so too did the grandeur of his festivals. One of the most elaborate Panquetzalistli became a multi-week performance of devotion and spectacle. The city was decorated in vibrant banners. Effigies were crafted with amaranth grain, considered sacred, shaped into Huitzilopochtli's likeness, carried through the streets, and eventually consumed in symbolic communion. Ritual runners dashed through the streets, bearing torches like veins of light, while the Templo Mayor became a vortex of incense, music, and structured bloodletting. Foreign visitors could not process it. To them, it seemed barbaric, and in some cases, that label served their political purposes well. Demonizing the rituals of the Mexica made conquest easier to justify. But these outsiders missed the deeper meaning. This was not chaos. It was order. Ritualized, choreographed, meaningful order. Blood, yes, but blood as prayer, as fuel, as promise. Still, by the late 15th century, the strain of maintaining such an elaborate cosmic contract was showing. The empire was vast, but its foundation was brittle. Tribute systems grew unstable. Vassal cities grew resentful. The sheer number of captives needed for ritual-strained diplomacy. And at the heart of it all, Huitzilopochtli's demands had not diminished. If anything, they had grown. The god had become the mirror of the state's own overreach, glorious, hungry, invincible seeming, but ultimately vulnerable. And in this vulnerability, there was irony. The god of war, who had defined an empire, would also witness its fall. For when the Spanish arrived, bearing crosses instead of serpents, their own myths in place of Nahua cosmology, they did more than topple temples. They disrupted the rhythm. They broke the loop. The sun still rose, but no blood flowed at dawn. Huitzilopochtli's image was smashed, his shrines repurposed, his festivals outlawed or masked under Catholic saints' days. But belief does not vanish so easily. In certain remote villages, oral traditions persisted. Hummingbirds were still seen as messengers. Certain phrases used in festivals carried echoes of old chants. The god, it seems, never quite left. He merely faded, like pigment washed from stone, like a name whispered in twilight, like a war cry softened by time. And thus we come to the end of the Feathered War, not in violence, but in erosion. Huitzilopochtli, the god who emerged fully formed, who marched at the head of an empire, whose temples were towers of power, faded into memory not with a scream, but a sigh. His myth did not die. It simply returned to the soil, like old feathers scattered by wind, like obsidian dulled by centuries. But in understanding him, we glimpse something enduring, the human need to shape chaos into meaning. The human compulsion to build structures, myths, empires, even if they must one day fall. The memory of Huitzilopochtli, though officially erased from temples and calendars, survived in subtler forms, embedded in the quiet persistence of language, in the shape of certain festivals repurposed to Catholic narratives in murals, later painted with saintly halos that barely concealed feathered headdresses beneath. In this final chapter of the god's long journey, what remains is not the roar of war drums or the blaze of sacrificial fires, but the stillness that follows, a stillness filled with echoes. Scholars in centuries to come would study codices recovered from conquistador flames, piecing together glyphs and stories, marveling at the sheer complexity of the Aztec worldview. They would find depictions of Huitzilopochtli leading the Mexica through the deserts, his voice carried by shamans, his standards raised in painted hands. They would argue over interpretations. Was he a solar metaphor, a cultural invention, a real remnant of older Toltec ideas reframed for imperial purposes? But to those who once lived under his watch, there was no ambiguity. He was the reason the sun rose, and now that certainty is gone. Yet the question remains, how does a society deal with the silence of a god? For many former subjects of the empire, life went on, under new masters, with new rituals, new gods. But the void Huitzilopochtli left was not easily filled. His hunger had ordered time. His presence had justified power. In his absence, what rhythm remained? What defined sacrifice, loyalty, devotion? These questions did not disappear. They merely shifted, finding new form in new beliefs. And still, certain stones remained. The base of the Templo Mayor was not leveled entirely. Farmers years later would dig into the soil and find fragments of obsidian, amaranth effigies buried in haste, figurines with hummingbird motifs. Children would play in the ruins without knowing why they felt strange there, as though something watched. The god was gone, yes, but the place still hummed. In the colonial period, certain Nahua nobles baptized, renamed, converted continued to tell stories of Huitzilopochtli in guarded tones, carefully cloaked in metaphor. They referred to him as the old sun, or the flower that once burned, or he who traveled ahead. These were not just nostalgic inventions, they were methods of survival. In a world where old gods had become forbidden, metaphor became sanctuary. And perhaps this is the most human element of the entire story, the need to preserve meaning. Even when stripped of temple and altar, even when forbidden from speaking plainly. The god, it turned out, did not need fire to endure. He needed only memory. And so, the feathered war did not end with conquest. It continued in silence, in code, in dreams. Today, Huitzilopochtli is studied more than worshipped. His name appears in museums, his image reconstructed in digital renderings, his myths dissected in university lectures. But to truly understand him, one must go beyond the artifacts. One must try to feel what it meant to wake each day, believing that your blood helped move the sun, that your city stood because you gave, that the balance of the cosmos was tied not to a divine whim, but to your actions, your rituals, your collective will. It is easy now to look back and label such belief as primitive or brutal, but such distance obscures understanding. For to the Mexica, Huitzilopochtli was not an abstract symbol. He was presence. He was weight. He was direction. He was the eastern horizon igniting. He was the reason for war, the shape of festivals, the fire behind ambition. He was empire rendered divine, and his fall, if fall it can be called, was not total. His story lingers in the language, in Nahuatl words still spoken, in place names, in the layered murals beneath colonial paint, in the hummingbirds that flit through central Mexico, iridescent and fast, in the beat of drums at modern festivals that still echo old rhythms even if the names have changed. There is something stubborn about gods made for empire. They do not disappear quietly. They dissolve, reappear, whisper. Huitzilopochtli may no longer sit atop the Templo Mayor, but he walks in shadow, in heat, in pulse. The feathered war then continues not in battle, but in breath, a reminder that belief leaves residue. That power, once sacralized, stains the stones long after the prayers have ceased. And in this residue, perhaps, lies the most poignant legacy of the god who demanded motion. Even in absence, he moves. Even in silence, he demands to be remembered. Even in ruins, he reigns. In this segment, we turn our gaze from the monumental gods of sun and conquest to something far older, far quieter. The whisper of myth traced not in scripture or stone, temples, but in dust-covered tablets buried beneath the ruins of cities lost to time. Before the thunder of empire and the clash of ideologies, there were cities that emerged slowly, pressed into the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. Grown from trade, irrigation, and fragile alliances. These cities, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, were not built for conquest, but for cultivation, for ritual, for mystery. And their gods were not warriors of the sky, but local, earthbound, transactional, gods of grain, of reeds, of canals. And yet, within the clay tablets unearthed from their foundations lies something profound. The earliest known attempts to make sense of the universe, to record ritual, to preserve divine dialogue. These were not stories meant to entertain. They were systems of survival. In this dusty silence, we begin to piece together what myth meant before it was mythology, when it was law, calendar, and chant. And what we find is not grand spectacle, but intimacy. A people who recorded not the glory of heroes, but the instructions for a proper libation, who chanted not of war, but of offerings to river gods in the dry season, who built ziggurats not as declarations of might, but as cosmic ladders, sacred scaffolding between the dirt and the heavens. In the blocks to follow, we will walk through these crumbling foundations. We will read what remains of their prayers. we will try to understand what it meant to live in a city whose entire rhythm was set by divine ritual. And we will see how the earliest myths were not myths at all, but memory, etched in dust, preserved in baked clay, waiting to be read again. Let us begin. In the still heat of southern Mesopotamia, under the watchful breath of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the first cities rose, not in triumph, but in slow negotiation with the earth. They emerged where the silt was thickest, where canals could be coaxed into lines like veins across the land, where the sun scorched evenly enough to allow grain to grow, but not so fiercely as to strip it bare. These were not cities of ambition, at least not at first. They were settlements clustered around survival, then shaped by rhythm, of floods, of harvest, of stars. And as they grew, they acquired something beyond shelter and subsistence. They acquired belief. But belief here did not thunder from mountaintops. It emerged gently, like mist off the irrigation ditches in the morning, soft and conditional. Their gods, Enki, Inanna, were not distant titans, but neighbors. They had homes in the city, not metaphorically, but physically. The temples were not places of worship alone. They were divine households. Each had its staff, bakers, brewers, scribes, singers, a full economic engine dedicated not to human rulers, but to the invisible inhabitants of the sacred quarters. And the people did not imagine their gods as omnipotent. They needed to be fed, clothed, appeased. The city itself was not just a place to live, but a stage upon which divine obligation played out in the form of daily offerings and ritual processions. The gods gave order, and in return, the people gave grain, time, song. Within this compact, the earliest myths began to form, not as myths in our modern sense, but as records. The clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, preserved everything from temple inventories to astronomical observations. But woven throughout are fragments of a worldview inseparable from the divine. A tablet might detail a barley loan and include a note about which god's feast it supported. A hymn might celebrate a city's founding while also describing a ritual marriage between the king and the goddess Inanna, meant to ensure fertility not just for the fields, but for the people. These were not stories that aimed to be entertaining or metaphorical. They were embedded into lifelike pigment into wet clay. They gave shape to time, structure to power, and purpose to suffering. And yet, as we read them now, as soft impressions translated from cuneiform by careful hands centuries later, they strike a tone both familiar and alien. There is reverence, yes, but also practicality. The gods were to be honored, but they were not above negotiation. If a plague struck, perhaps it was because the offering of beer had been too weak. If the canals dried, perhaps a rite was missed. Myth, in this context, was not fatalistic. It was responsive. Correct the ritual, and balance might return. The temples themselves reflect this. Unlike later cathedrals or mosques, they were not designed to awe the eye so much as to function. Storage rooms for grain and oil, platforms for sacrificial fires, chambers for statues to be washed and dressed. These were the spaces where theology met logistics, and this marriage of the sacred and the mundane is perhaps the most striking feature of early urban religion. The gods did not hover above, they lived among. When we read the myths of these cities, particularly the creation stories, we find that humans are not born of love or divine whim, but of necessity. One Sumerian tale tells that the gods, burdened by labor, created humans from clay mixed with divine blood so that the people could take over the hard work. It is a myth without romance, but full of purpose. We exist to relieve divine fatigue, and this idea that humans serve the gods through labor, through ritual, through offerings, became the organizing principle of Mesopotamian life. The year was divided by festivals. Each festival required preparation, cleaning the temple, brewing sacred beer, sculpting temporary effigies. In one festival, a clay model of a demon might be paraded through the streets and symbolically defeated to represent the restoration of order. In another, the statue of the city's patron deity would be removed from the temple, carried along the canals by boat, visiting the gods of neighboring cities in an act of cosmic diplomacy. These rituals were not quaint celebrations. They were state functions, often involving the king, the priests, and thousands of citizens. They were attempts to ensure that the divine machinery kept turning. That water flowed, crops grew, peace held. And for centuries, it worked. Cities rose and fell, kings were named and forgotten, but the rhythm of myth remained. Even as new empires absorbed the old, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, they inherited not just land and law, but ritual. They changed the names, sometimes the language, but not the structure. The gods still had temples. The cities still hummed with chants. The tablets kept being pressed, dried, stacked. But not all myths survived. Many were never translated, their cuneiform lines still waiting in archives or buried in ruined mounds. Others were erased deliberately or accidentally, when fires consumed libraries or scribes died without apprentices. What we have today is fragmentary, a mosaic of what once was a living system of divine relationship. Yet even in these fragments, a picture emerges of people who did not separate the sacred from the secular, who understood the city as a cosmic device, each citizen a cog in a divine economy. And so, we sit now, millennia later, reading their myths not in temple courts, but under museum lights. We hear their voices faintly, in the rhythm of a ritual line, the plea of a supplicant, the dry inventory of a temple offering. We sense, in the tablets, not just belief, but structure. A world held together by gods who needed feeding, by cities built as offerings, by stories that were never meant to end. But to understand these myths fully, we must also understand their medium. The humble clay tablet, before paper, before parchment, before scrolls rolled tightly in libraries, there was wet earth molded into rectangles, pressed gently with reeds. The writing cuneiform was not merely script, it was architecture. Tiny wedges pressed into the surface in carefully arranged lines, requiring a trained hand and a sharp eye. The scribes who made them were not mere copyists. They were artisans, scholars, and intermediaries between gods and kings. To become a scribe was to enter a priesthood of knowledge. In schools called Edaba, young men, for they were almost always male, learned not just how to form the marks, but the traditions behind them. They copied lexical lists, hymns, omen texts, royal inscriptions. Each mark was a pathway, not just to language, but to cosmology. And the act of copying was itself a kind of devotion. Through repetition, the rhythm of myth was preserved. And these scribes did not write at random. Each tablet had a purpose. Some recorded divine genealogy, others mapped out rituals. Still others detailed the myths that explained why a river turned or why the stars aligned a certain way. These myths were not ornamental. They were explanatory models. They made sense of the unpredictable, the flood that came early, the child who died without cause, the blight that ruined an entire season. In each case, a story gave shape to the pain. A tale of a god who grew jealous, a demon who escaped his binding, a rite that had been performed improperly. And with each explanation came a prescription, a ritual to restore balance, an offering to placate, a chant to remember. In this way, myth was not only memory, it was medicine. And yet, for all their order, these stories carried ambiguity. The gods of these first cities were not paragons of virtue. They were moody, inconsistent, sometimes petty. Inanna might bless fertility one season and withhold it the next. Enlil could grant victory or send disease. The myths make no effort to justify divine behavior. Instead, they reflect it, in all its unpredictability. The gods were not supposed to be perfect. They were powerful. And power was to be respected, managed, feared. This emotional ambiguity is perhaps most evident in the great Mesopotamian epics, Gilgamesh foremost among them, though technically a later text. Gilgamesh is deeply rooted in earlier Sumerian stories and offers a window into the evolving mythic consciousness of the region. In it, we find gods who punish without warning, heroes who mourn their friends, and questions, profound unresolved questions about mortality, meaning, and the limits of human power. It is a myth that ends in failure. Gilgamesh does not find eternal life. He returns home, older, sadder, wiser. And in that, perhaps, lies the core of Mesopotamian myth. Not triumph, but understanding. These myths were not designed to offer salvation. They offered explanation, consolation, structure, and the rituals built from them were meant not to save, but to sustain, to restore rhythm, if not joy. And they did, for centuries. Even as wars came and cities were burned. Even as the Akkadians swept through with new gods and languages, the tablets kept being written. Temples destroyed were rebuilt, rituals reassembled. And though the names shifted, the structure endured. The ziggurat remained the cosmic mountain. The statue of the god remained the axis of civic life. And the scribe remained the silent archivist of divine will. What is most striking, though, is how much of this survived not in grand temples, but in private homes. Archaeologists have found tablets buried in floorboards, tucked into corners, stored in baskets. Families preserved myths alongside property records and medical recipes. For them, myth was not a relic of the elite. It was daily life. A story to tell a child when a fever came. A charm to whisper when a birth went long. A reminder that the gods, though invisible, were never absent. Even now, in the scattered archives of museums across the world, the mythic pulse of these cities continues to flicker. Each tablet is a small act of resistance, against forgetting, against the erosion of time. Each line is a breath from a world that once believed the stars and canals and crops were held together by story. Not by story as entertainment, but as structure, as scaffolding, as sacred map. And though most of us no longer live according to these myths, they shape the systems we still inhabit. The calendar, the bureaucracy, the idea that time itself can be recorded and managed. These were not the side effects of civilization. They were its foundation. And they began, not with conquest, but with clay. As we delve deeper into the rituals these tablets describe, a quiet but complex picture emerges, not one of spectacle or grand public ceremony alone, but of deeply structured, private, and cyclical devotion. The rituals in early Mesopotamian cities were not reserved for festivals or kings. They permeated the days of potters, weavers, midwives, and merchants. A woman grinding barley might mutter a small prayer to Nisaba, the goddess of writing and grain. A man carving a doorway might pause to press a tiny image of Pazuzu, a protective spirit, into the wall's clay before plastering it over. In homes, altars were modest, often just a shelf with a small figurine, a dish of oil, or a fragment of a once larger statue. Offerings might include a handful of lentils, a bit of beer, or a curl of incense. These were not acts of piety as we often imagine them today, but of relationship maintenance, small gestures to keep the balance, to maintain good standing with the forces believed to govern harvests, fertility, and health. The myths preserved on tablets were often not elaborate stories, but prayers structured like contracts. If I do this, you will do that. If we offer this, the river will rise. If we sing this, the sickness will leave. Embedded in these formulas was a worldview both humble and transactional. The gods were not bound by love. They were bound by agreement, by precedent, by ritual. This is perhaps why temples were so carefully maintained. A crumbling wall or a spoiled offering could invite disaster. And so the citizens of these cities, not just priests, bore the responsibility of divine upkeep. They cleaned the streets for procession days. They helped ferry statues across canals. They observed the prescribed silences, fasts, and chants. These were not arbitrary impositions. They were woven into the fabric of city life. And the city, in turn, was understood as a living being. Its heart, the temple. Its breath, the markets. Its memory, the tablets. The myths, then, were not passive texts. They were activations, rituals frozen in words, ready to be spoken aloud, to be reawakened. Some tablets bear wear marks, suggesting they were held repeatedly, perhaps read during ceremonies. Others are recopied versions of older versions, the scribes acting less like authors and more like conduits. Each retelling was a renewal. Each recitation a way to keep the world turning just a little longer. Among the most fascinating ritual myths are those involving sacred marriages, often between a king and a goddess, sometimes a nana, sometimes another local deity. These were not symbolic unions alone. They involved processions, feasting, songs of seduction and consummation, and, in some cases, physical enactment by priestly stand-ins. The goal was not merely spectacle, but cosmic alignment. By ritually marrying the goddess, the king renewed the land's fertility and reaffirmed his legitimacy. It was myth as performance, not to entertain, but to sustain. And while we can't fully reconstruct these ceremonies, the surviving hymns give us a glimpse. They speak of longing, of divine beauty, of joy and tremor. They echo with a humanity that is startling across millennia. A goddess asks for kisses. A king praises her thighs. In the sacred and the sensual, there was no contradiction. Desire was divine. Fertility was holy. Life in all its forms was part of the mythic circuit. But not all rituals were joyous. Some dealt with death, illness, and chaos. One category of mythic text describes the appeasement of demons believed to cause disease. These rituals often involved crafting small figurines, reciting specific incantations, and burying or burning the representations. Others prescribed midnight rites under certain stars or dictated a sequence of chants to be spoken at riverbanks. These were not vague superstitions. They were codified systems, passed down, tested, adjusted. And though we might not recognize them as science, they served a similar role, offering structure against the unknowable. Even the architecture of the cities reflected this. Temples were aligned with stars, doorways with cardinal directions. Ziggurats, those layered stepped towers, mimicked mountains not found in the southern plains. They symbolized the cosmic axis, the meeting point of heaven and earth. At the top, a room would house the god's statue, not for public view, but for priestly maintenance. These statues were not idols in the modern dismissive sense. They were embodiments, fed daily, clothed, anointed. A missing ritual might mean famine. A poorly recited chant, invasion. The people believed this not out of fear, but because it was how order had always been kept. And within this system, myth thrived not as entertainment, but as scaffolding for reality. When the flood season came, myths explained why the gods allowed the water to rise. When a baby cried through the night, myths offered names for the spirits who might be disturbing it, and the rites to send them away. When a king fell ill, myths provided both blame and balm. This intimate entanglement of story and structure is perhaps the most defining feature of the first urban myths. They were not told for fun. They were told because they were necessary. And they survived not just in temple halls, but in kitchens, in fields, in whispers passed between generations. And though many of these stories have been lost, crumbled with their tablets, scattered by conquest, the ones we have are enough to remind us that myth was once breath itself, the breath of cities, the breath of people trying always to understand why the world was as it was, and what they might do to keep it from falling apart. And so we return to the tablets themselves, the clay rectangles left behind like fossilized thoughts, hardened by time and fire, accidental survivors of flood, invasion, and neglect. What they tell us collectively is not just what the ancients believed, but how they lived within their beliefs. These were not myths imposed from above, nor fables created in idle moments. They were utilities, frameworks, devices for continuity. And nowhere is this more evident than in the rhythm of daily civic life. In these early cities, myths and rituals were not confined to temples or festival days. They were baked into the calendar, which itself was structured around celestial events and agricultural cycles. The appearance of a specific star signaled not just the planting season, but a ritual act. The turn of the moon might mean the renewal of a contract with a local deity. Even silence could be ritual. A day without speech to honor a god's mourning. Time itself was measured mythically. Days were auspicious or dangerous based not on the weather, but on remembered divine patterns. And this memory was communal. Each neighborhood had its rites, each family their inherited chants or gestures. Some of these were likely idiosyncratic, passed along imperfectly. Others were reinforced by the schools. The Edaba were scribes trained in the master texts, learning not just how to read and write, but how to interpret, how to question, how to preserve. There were commentaries too, metatexts, tablets that explained tablets, that debated the meanings of certain divine names or compared versions of a ritual line. In this way, myth became a tradition of interpretation, not a fixed dogma. It could evolve within limits, and this flexibility allowed the system to absorb shocks, invasions, dynastic change, famine. A god might be renamed, merged with another, assigned a new domain. Myths would adjust accordingly. But the structure, the belief in ritual, in divine order, mirrored in human practice, remained firm. This is what allowed the myths to outlast the languages in which they were written. Sumerian gave way to Akkadian, which gave way to Babylonian and Assyrian. Yet many of the same stories persisted, retold in new dialects, adapted to new rulers. A flood myth in Sumer becomes the backbone of the Gilgamesh tale. An agricultural hymn becomes a royal inscription. The layers build, myths sedimented into memory, and still the tablets come. Thousands of them, stored in museum archives, many untranslated, some fragmentary, others pristine. Each one a whisper from a lost speaker. Some are mundane, inventories, debts, letters, but even these carry mythic fingerprints. A merchant swears by a god's name. A contract invokes divine oversight. Myth was not separate from law, from trade, from the texture of life. It was infused. And as we read these texts today, trying to piece together the beliefs of people who lived for 5, even 6,000 years ago, we begin to feel the slow, steady beat of their world. A beat that was not dramatic, not driven by conquest or cataclysm, but by continuity. By the belief that what one did today mattered, not just to one's neighbor or king, but to the cosmos, to the balance of all things. That lighting the right fire, reciting the right phrase, observing the right silence could align the heavens. That is myth as infrastructure, as a shared operating system for civilization. And perhaps most striking of all, these early myths were not exclusionary. The gods of one city could coexist with those of another. A family might honor a local river spirit and a national god. There was room in the system. No rigid orthodoxy, no heresy as we understand it. What mattered was participation, the rhythm, the repeated act, the voice rising again with remembered words. Even today, that voice echoes, not only in the museums and translations, but in our own habits of ritual. Lighting candles on certain days, whispering intentions, marking time with symbols. These are not new inventions. They are inherited impulses. And though our myths have changed, their function to soothe, to structure, to explain, remains. In the dust of forgotten cities, we find ourselves, our questions, our hopes, our fears of disorder. And in the clay, we find their answers. Not always correct, not always clear, but always careful, always deliberate, always trying as we do now, to make meaning from the vast, strange world around us. And perhaps what is most quietly astonishing, most moving even, is that so many of these tablets were never meant to last. Clay was cheap. It was the parchment of the poor, the not yet permanent. Often, once information was no longer needed, a tablet would be discarded, recycled, or crumbled. Yet the ones we hold today, those in glass cases or wrapped in archival foam in drawers beneath museums, survived because of fire. Not fire as preservation, but fire as destruction. Cities burned, libraries collapsed, temples looted. And the flames, instead of erasing, baked the clay, rendering it durable. By accident, memory hardened. What was once ephemeral became fossil. And now, across the centuries, we look upon them on the angled script, the ancient impressions, and try to hear the voices again. They do not shout. They gnomer, dazzle. They murmur. They whisper of a time when every act was threaded with meaning, when story was not mere tale but compass, and the myths they carried. Those that told of gods who wept, of kings who failed, of demons banished, were not just about the divine, but about the human, about the struggle to persist, to organize, to explain. In many ways, these early myths were proto-science, proto-psychology, where ethics. They did not answer with precision, but they framed the right questions. What does it mean to live well? Why do we suffer? How do we keep order? And what happens if we fail? These are the questions still asked, still echoed in modern philosophies, in literature, in dreams. And the answers, though clothed differently, often carry the same rhythms. In the first cities, they answered through ritual, through repetition, through myth. The gods were not outside of life, but inside it. Not only creators, but curators of cycles, of death and rebirth, planting and harvest, silence and speech. To worship was to participate. To know the myth was to know the timing, the pattern, the steps, and that knowing was power. Not political, perhaps, though scribes often held courtly sway, but metaphysical. To hold the story was to hold the structure, and those structures, encoded in stories, became the unseen frameworks of civilization. And here, at the quiet close of this journey through dust and divinity, we are left with a paradox. These myths were born of fragility, of river floods, failed crops, wandering armies, and yet they endured. Not despite their simplicity, but because of their embeddedness. They were not distractions. They were instructions. And we, so many centuries later, read them not to believe what they believed, but to understand how they believed, how they structured chaos, how they ritualized fear, how they turned the ineffable into rhythm. That is the enduring gift of these tablets in the dust. Not their facts, not even their gods, but their method of facing the unknown with form, with voice, with story. And so, as we leave this segment, this meditation on the first city's myths, we do so not with answers, but with a kind of reverent quiet. The quiet of a scribe's stylus scratching wet clay. The quiet of a priest lighting a lamp in a temple's inner chamber. The quiet of a child listening to a tale told for the 100th time by a parent who once heard it from their own. These silences are not voids, they are echoes. And in them, the pulse of myth continues.
In this final part of our journey, we step not into the shadowy underworld or the whispered myths etched into clay, but into the brilliant, gold-drenched heart of a living city, Tenochtitlan, where divinity walked in sandals and power was measured, not just in blood, but in rhythm, ritual, and the sheer awe of a people shaped by cosmology. Imagine, if you will, waking not in a hut or a dusty temple chamber, but in a palace of polished obsidian and feathered canopy, where every breath you take is considered sacred, where your steps are timed to celestial movement, and where your name is not simply spoken, but sung by hundreds. You are not a priest, you are not a noble, you're divine royalty, the Huitzilopochtli, the great speaker, the one who channels the gods. And your day does not begin with leisure, it begins with obligation. For the sun even gilds the lake that surrounds the city. You are awakened by the soft whisper of incense and the rustle of attendants. You are to be bathed, not by your own hand, but by ritual servants trained in the exact motions and offerings. The water is cool, perfumed with copal, and poured in precise patterns to invoke purification, not just of body, but of spirit. The garments you wear are woven with symbolic threads: red for sacrifice, blue for the sky gods, jade for fertility. Your headdress is not merely decorative, it is a glyph in motion, a message to the gods. And as you step into the courtyard, you do so as a living conduit between worlds, between earth and sky, death and breath, chaos and maze. But this role is not about luxury, it is about burden. Every action you take is watched, not only by the hundreds of nobles and priests who accompany you, but by the gods themselves, whose expectations are inscribed in every stone of the city. Tenochtitlan was not built on whim. It was a cosmogram, a sacred map-made stone, its avenues aligned to stars, its temples mirroring mountains, its canals reflecting the celestial rivers above. To be royalty here meant to maintain the symmetry. A festival missed, a rite performed out of season, a misstep in the calendar. These were not small errors, were cosmic fractures. So your breakfast, when it comes, is ceremonial. Maize cakes, blessed by priests. Chocolate frothed to honor Quetzalcoatl. No bite is eaten without an invocation, no sip without gratitude. And then begins the audience, not with subjects, but with interpreters, priests, scholars, astronomers, warriors. They report signs: a flock flying wrong, a drought lingering too long, a dream repeated by too many. You must listen, not as a man, but as an axis. Your responses are not simply decisions. They are interpretations of divine will. A campaign of war, a new temple, a public penance. These are not matters of strategy, they are matters of balance. To lead Tenochtitlan is to perform it, daily, completely, with your own body as instrument. And always, always, the gods are hungry. You must feed them, not only with offerings of incense and fruit and jade, though these are frequent and fragrant, but with blood. And here lies the heaviest of your duties. For the gods to ensure rain, to guard the sun's daily path, to spare the city from disease and flood, they must be nourished with life. And though you may not wield the obsidian knife yourself, you sanction it. You are present, you watch. Sometimes you speak the final blessing. Sometimes you fast for days beforehand, purifying yourself, so that your presence does not taint the rite. And in the festivals, the great ones, the ones where the drums echo like a heartbeat across the lake, you must dance, for hours, in full regalia. Each step mapped, each turn choreographed. You are not simply moving, you are enacting the stories. The slaying of darkness, the return of the maize god, the rebirth of spring. Your body becomes myth, and the people watch. Not with entertainment in mind, but with reverence. Because if you stumble, if you falter, if the rhythm breaks, they believe the seasons may fail. The sun may not rise, the world may end. This is the weight of divine royalty in Tenochtitlan. Not feasting and lounging, but pressure. Constant pressure. And while gifts pour in, gold, feathers, tribute from conquered lands, they are not yours to hoard. They are symbols, tools. They must be redistributed, offered, woven into the fabric of state and faith. Because power here is performative, must be seen, felt, ritualized. A god that hides grows weak, and a Tlatoani who forgets his role ceases to be divine. He becomes only a man, and that is dangerous. Not only for him, who may be deposed or worse, but for the city, which sees in him the image of cosmic alignment. Its failure becomes a fracture in the mirror. And so, you do not rest easily. Your bed may be soft, but your dreams are watched. Dreams in Tenochtitlan matter. They are decoded, compared, mapped like constellations. One wrong vision may require a fast. 2 may demand confession. 3, well, that may be a sign from Huitzilopochtli himself, the smoking mirror god, that your path has shifted, that your face must be repainted, And so the cycle continues, day after day, breath after breath. You are divine, but also prisoner. Free in name, but bound by ritual. Rich in treasure, but poorer than a child when it comes to unstructured time, because every hour belongs to the gods. Every step to the calendar. Every word to the legacy of the Mexica. And yet, you do it. Because without you, the center wobbles, the sun hesitates, the rains falter. And deep down, perhaps you believe it too. Not as a fact, but as a feeling, a rhythm learned since childhood. The rhythm of duty, of cosmology, of being the spine of a sacred city.
And beneath it all, beneath the turquoise-encrusted masks and jaguar pelt thrones, beneath the elaborate rituals and endless petitions from nobles, there lies a more intimate layer of divine royalty. The personal, because even gods in human form, even rulers whose titles are spoken only with reverent breath, are still, at their core, human. You feel hunger, though your meals are sacred. You feel fatigue, though rest is ritualized. You feel doubt, though you must never show it. And perhaps most deeply, you feel watched. Not just by your court, but by your ancestors, whose spirits linger in the hearth's smoke. In the obsidian mirrors, in the stars overhead. They were Tlatoani too. They bore the weight. They made sacrifices. Some were praised in hymns, their names etched in cadiz. Others faded, forgotten in the shuffle of conquest and plague. Which will you be? That question hums beneath your every decision. You remember that power in Tenochtitlan is never inherited simply by blood, but by the favor of the gods and the support of the priesthood. Your rise was a ritual, a selection, a testing, a coronation that included walking barefoot to the Great Pyramid, fasting, bleeding, dancing for hours until your body screamed. And now, years later, you still carry that moment. The pain of the blade against your ear as blood was offered, the roar of the crowds, the silence afterward when you stood alone, newly divine. But being divine is not a state of grace, it is a labor. You do not own your body, it belongs to symbol. You do not speak your thoughts, only what the gods would have you say. And your family, they too are symbols. Your wives, yes, wives for polygamy among the elite is both a right and a duty, are selected with strategic care. Some are daughters of allies, others priestesses who strengthen your bond to the gods. Your children are not simply your own. They are future sacrifices, future priests, future marriages. Each is a token on the great board of empire. And while you may love them, tuck them into bed with feathered dolls. Bless their foreheads with maize paste. You do so knowing they may be called to war, to ritual, to politics. Your sons may be torn by the same machine that crowned you. Your daughters may be sent to temples or traded in alliance. You rarely speak plainly, even in your own home. Every word has weight. Every phrase echoes. So you learn to live in subtext, in metaphor. You speak through ritual, through gesture, through sanctioned silence. You perform your own life. Even your grief must be choreographed. When a flood destroys crops, you do not cry. You fast. You wear the robe of sackcloth. You walk barefoot to the temple and cut your thigh. And the people see this, and they do not pity you. They honor you, because in your suffering, the world is balanced. In your sacrifice, they see their own lifted. It is not loneliness, exactly, it is singularity. There is no one else like you. You are not quite human, not quite divine. You live in the borderland between worlds. And the city? Oh, the city. It reflects you. Tenochtitlan is your mirror. Its canals are your arteries. Its marketplaces your breath. Its temples your spine. When it flourishes, you are strong. When it falters, your hands are stained. And the omens. Always the omens. A comet here, a birth with extra digits. A dream of serpents. The priests bring them to you like messages scrawled by the gods themselves, and you must interpret. Act, sacrifice. Adjust the calendar, declare a holy day. Change a tax, send an expedition. All of it is theater, yes, but theater with teeth. Get it wrong and the city may pay the price. The rains may not come. The plague may spread. And when that happens, when disaster strikes, as it always does, the people do not blame chance. They blame misalignment. The gods are not angry without cause. Someone failed to please them. And who is closer to the gods than you? You feel their gaze most strongly during the great festivals, when the city swells with incense and drumbeats, when the causeways shake with dancers and the pyramids are slick with flower petals. You stand atop the Templo Mayor, arms outstretched, and look upon your people. Thousands upon thousands, all turn to you. You begin the chant. The priests follow. The crowd echoes. A wave of sound and rhythm passes through the city like breath. And you, for a moment, feel it. Transcendence. Not power, but presence. The alignment of body, city, cosmos. The fulfillment of your role. In those moments, you forget the weight. You are the sun incarnate, the God in motion, but it never lasts. The next day brings the petitions, the drought, the illness, the omen. You return to duty. And always, in the back of your mind, the knowledge that empires fall, that gods are forgotten, that one day, even your name may crumble, may fade, may be buried beneath the lake mud. And yet, you persist. Because to be divine royalty in Tenochtitlan is not to seek immortality. It is to become a vessel, a brief flame in a long, sacred lineage. You are not eternal. But the rhythm you uphold, that might be, and that, in the end, is enough. In this endless orbit of power and piety, where duty was laced with dread and ritual-masked routine, the royal life in Tenochtitlan demanded not only physical endurance and political skill, but a profound spiritual discipline, one that blurred the line between personal identity and divine embodiment. To be a Tlatoani, the speaker who does not simply rule but channels, was to exist as both man and myth, flesh and glyph. There were moments, of course, where the veil shimmered thinly, where you found a trace of your own self beneath the layers of ceremonial language and carved expectations. Perhaps it was in a quiet corner of the palace, watching your child draw spirals in dust with a jade pendant. Or maybe it was the soft chant of an old woman placing maize offerings by the lake, whispering prayers you'd heard once, years ago, from your own mother. These flashes of something private, unstructured, human, they came rarely, but with aching clarity. And then, almost as soon as they arrived, they dissolved into the great machinery of myth again. Because even your memories must be shaped by purpose. Even your nostalgia must serve structure. The city, after all, was built on story. Every stone of Tenochtitlan echoed with intent. The steps of the great temple rising not merely for grandeur, but to trace the myth of Huitzilopochtli's victory over his sister Coilzocui. The plaza mirrored the heavens, each market stall a node in the living constellation of economic and spiritual trade. And you, placed at the center, were not allowed to forget your axis. Each time you stepped into the council chamber, the codices flanking you whispered reminders of past rulers, not as inspiration, but as warnings. Their deeds were etched in stylized strokes, triumphs, failures, sacrifices. You could almost hear them breathe behind the bark paper scrolls. And the priesthood, your uneasy partners, were the keepers of that breath. They advised, yes, but they also watched. No divine royalty ruled without the sanction of the temples. Their support was not simply theological. It was logistical, cultural, ancestral. Without their blessing, no festival could be held, no omen interpreted, no god appeased. You walked a careful line between influence and obedience. The calendar dictated not just the year's progression, but the city's pulse. Each day had its god, each number its fate. And you, despite all titles and robes, were bound to that calendar as tightly as the lowest initiate. When the day called for sacrifice, you fasted. When it called for feast, you hosted. When it called for blood, you sanctioned it, or, at times, gave your own. In certain high rituals, it was your own thigh, your own tongue, your own ear that was cut. The blood of divine royalty was seen as a particularly potent offering, rich with cosmological force. And it was not considered bravery. It was expectation, but wounds heal. What lingered more was the silence that followed ritual. The hours afterward, alone, swaddled not in feathers, but in the cold awareness that what you'd just done, what you must continue doing, stitched your life into something beyond comprehension. There were nights, long and windless, when you lay in your chamber, listening to the lake slap gently against the chinampas. Through the thin slats of your window came the scent of night-blooming flowers, mixed faintly with ash from distant braziers. And in that moment, you might wonder, not aloud, never aloud, if it was worth it. Not for yourself. Your soul, after all, was woven into duty. But for them, your people. Were their lives better for your bloodletting? Were their crops richer, their children stronger? Or had they, too, become actors in a divine pageant whose ending none could foresee? Such thoughts could not be voiced, to advisors, not to wives, not to gods. But they sat in your bones, as constant as the ache in your joints from too many nights spent standing on stone, arms raised toward stars. And yet, you rose again. You always rose. Because that is what the gods demanded, and what the people needed. You were their compass, their calendar, their measure of cosmic health. If you wavered, they faltered. If you despaired, they starved. Your steadiness was their sustenance. And so you greeted each day with ritual, not merely for form, but for survival. The rituals stabilized more than the gods. They stabilized you. The rhythm of incense, the cadence of chant, the repetition of gesture. They created a structure strong enough to carry the unbearable weight of your crown. And still, you dreamed. Of cities yet to rise, of temples not yet built, of a time when your name would be sung beside the sun itself, etched not just in stone, but in memory. You dreamed because dreaming, too, was sacred. Because without vision, even a god becomes hollow. And in your dreams, you were not Tlatoani. You were a boy running barefoot across a reed path, laughing at the herons, unburdened by the sky. That boy lived somewhere still, buried beneath the feathers, beneath the jade, beneath 1,000 eyes of expectation. And maybe, just maybe, when you return to the stars, when your soul is unspooled in smoke and your name becomes glyph, he will rise again. Not to rule, but simply to be. And that thought, quiet and flickering, is enough to sustain you for another day in the golden cage of divinity. The fourth sun beats down over Tenochtitlan, and still you rise. The morning ceremonies begin before the mist even lifts from Lake Texcoco, before the market awakes, before the children stir. You are there, present in the hush, in the slow light, cloaked not in grandeur, but in the solemn repetition of a god-king's duties. In the center of your palace, the courtyard stones still hold the chill of night, and you kneel upon them barefoot. A priest anoints your brow with pouche. Another ties a strip of blood-red cotton around your wrist. You don't flinch. You haven't in years. Your skin has grown used to ritual, your mind to its pattern. The daily offerings to Huitzilopochtli must not only be perfect, they must be predictable. The people find peace in repetition. In certainty, you are the steward of both. It is said, the gods walk in cycles. Birth, death, rebirth, and so too must you. Today is not yesterday, but it must rhyme with it. And in this rhythm lies safety. After ritual, you meet the scribes. Reports of the valley arrive on painted bark. Crop yields, canal repairs, disputes among nobles. You listen quietly, responding only when needed. Your voice carries weight, not volume. A gesture can end a career. A word can seal a marriage. But there is little joy in governance. It is maintenance, not majesty. Still, within these bureaucratic hours, there are small moments of humanity. You remember a scribe, young, nervous, ink-stained, who once handed you a report on gold weights, only for a breeze to scatter his scrolls across the courtyard. You watched him scramble like a bird, red-faced, and said nothing. Just offered him another day. You never saw him again. Perhaps the priests removed him. Perhaps he was reassigned. But the image lingered, a man reduced by fear of your gaze. It reminded you of something you'd almost forgotten, that before you ruled, you feared too. You feared poorly reciting your lineage before the priesthood. You feared your first bloodletting. You feared that when you climbed the pyramid for your coronation, you might stumble. And what omen would that be? But you didn't. You reached the top. You offered your own blood to the sun. You became the sun's shadow. And that's what you've remained. Not its equal, but its echo. The city's festivals continue, and each year they grow larger, more choreographed, more dazzling. Dancers from distant provinces perform before you in brilliant plumage. Musicians strike drums carved from jaguar hide. Children reenact creation myths in miniature. And always, at the climax, there is sacrifice. Sometimes animals, sometimes men. Always sacred. You no longer flinch. You did once. The first time. Not from the blood, but from the crowd. From the cheer. You realize then that what you witnessed was not horror, but belief. A belief older than the pyramids, older than Mays. A belief that life must feed life. That death was not an end, but a door. And that the door must be opened with precision and reverence. You, of course, do not perform the sacrifices. That is the priest's domain, but you witness them. You are the anchor, the presence of divinity to validate the rite, and they look to you. Always, your face must be still. Your gaze unwavering, your posture immaculate. Even when the sky darkens, even when the wind dies and the priests whisper of eclipses and ill omens. Especially then, because if you falter, the gods might turn. And if they turn, the sun might stall. And if the sun stalls, all is undone. You carry that fear in silence, and yet you find ways to tether yourself to gentler truths. In the palace gardens, rare orchids bloom beside carved basalt fountains. You walk there in the dusk, alone, fingers brushing the petals. No one sees you. Here, you are not ruler or god, just presence, just breath. You remember the first time you saw a hummingbird drink from a flower, how it hovered, still and frantic, all at once. The priests called it an omen of Huitzilopochtli, but you thought it was simply beautiful. The quiet of these moments is not escape, it is rebalancing. Because to be divine royalty in Tenochtitlan is to live in constant tilt. Toward ritual, toward gaze, toward legacy. The gardens bring you level, if only for a breath. And breath is sacred. Still, the world presses in. Envoys from other cities arrive bearing tribute and veiled threats. Spaniards, strange and pale, appear along the coast, speaking tongues no priest can interpret. Bearing gods in iron and disease in breath. You feel the world shifting beneath your sandals. The stars look different, the omens change, but your role does not. You must remain steady. You must continue the rites. You must be divine, even when divinity falters. Because that is what your people need. Not certainty, but presence. Not prophecy, but rhythm. And so, you rise again, and again, and again. And when night falls over Tenochtitlan, when the canals fall silent and the lake becomes a mirror of obsidian, you sit in your high chamber far above the temples, far above the sleeping markets, and you listen to the hush. The braziers glow with soft amber, casting long shadows over glyph-covered walls. Outside, the city breathes in rhythm, unaware of the weight resting on your shoulders, unaware that the divine is also weary. The gods do not sleep, the priests say. But you are not only God, you are also man. And in the solitude of your chamber, with no ceremony to uphold and no advisors to impress, you let your shoulders fall. Your robes grow heavy with meaning, and for a moment you remember their weight not in feathers but in hours. The endless hours spent performing. Because being divine royalty in Tenochtitlan is not a gift. It is a performance perfected by necessity. You are the symbol, not the self. The mask must never crack, not even here, not even now. Yet sometimes, late in the night, you find your eyes drifting to the obsidian mirror mounted on the wall, not for divination, not to speak with Tezcatlipoca, but to simply see. To see yourself not as others see you, not as the embodiment of a sun, not as the face of the empire, but as a man. Tired, wondering, thinking. Your face is lined, not from age, but from repetition. The same words, the same rites, the same weight. You imagine what it might be like to be anonymous, to walk through the chinampas as a farmer, to barter for maize in the market, to sit beside a fire and tell stories with no need to inspire or instruct. And then you shake the thought. It is indulgent, dangerous. You were chosen. Or so they say. Your lineage was traced. The omens were read. The blood was tested. You were shaped for this, carved like a god from a boy. The sculptor, of course, was tradition. Firm, unyielding, repetitive. And now that sculpture must hold still, even as the winds of change rise. You've heard rumors. Whispers of ships larger than temples. Of men with metal skins. Of plagues that melt whole villages. You ask the priests, and they deflect. You ask the generals, and they reassure. But in the pit of your stomach, that place no ritual can reach, you feel the tremor. You wonder, if the gods of Tenochtitlan falter, who will remember you? Will your name survive the sun setting? Will the stones speak your story to those who build atop them? Or will your legacy be folded into another's myth, reshaped, renamed, perhaps forgotten altogether? You do not fear death, not as a god, not even as a man. What you fear is silence, the kind of silence that comes when memory dies. And so, you act. You commission new temples. You rededicate old ones. You order the scribes to rewrite the codices, larger, clearer, more beautiful. Let your deeds be etched, not only in stone, but in song. Let no child ever say they did not know who you were. In public, you are serene, majestic, eternal. In private, you are deliberate, strategic, hopeful, and sometimes, just sometimes, afraid. But fear is not a flaw, it is a signal. The gods, too, feared. Tezcatlipoca feared the rise of Quetzalcoatl. Huitzilopochtli feared being forgotten. Even divinity is not without anxiety. So you allow yours to be folded into your rituals. You let the rhythm carry it. Inhale, chant, exhale. Sacrifice, inhale, chant, exhale, rule. And it works, for now. Tenochtitlan still gleams. The temples still echo with drums. The people still kneel. You are still the axis, but you know, deep down, that axis turn. Cycles end, suns set, and so you prepare. You teach your children the rites. You walk the corridors of the palace more slowly, taking in the murals, the smells, the voices. You try to memorize the city, not as a god would, but as a man might, because one day, even gods become dust, even feathers rot, even gold melts, but memory, if cultivated, may linger. And perhaps that is your final ritual, to be remembered well. Not just as a ruler, not just as a god, but as someone who carried the sky a little longer. Someone who held the sun steady. Someone who rose day after day, night after night, so that others might believe, might hope, might dream. The braziers dim, the city sighs. And you, divine, exhausted, enduring. Close your eyes. Tomorrow you will rise again. And now you have walked among gods, not the thunderous, omnipotent titans of mythic grandeur, but the quieter, stranger, more fragile divinities who once shaped the world through breath, ritual, and repetition. You felt the weight of the sky as a cosmic caretaker, the loneliness of royalty perched atop a floating empire. The rhythm of sacrifice stitched into daily life like the passing of seasons. And in each corner of this world, from sunlit plazas to obsidian mirrors, you glimpse the humanity that rests behind the mask of the divine. What does it truly mean to be a god? Perhaps not power, not always peace, but presence, endurance. Memory, the gods of the Aztec world lived because they were seen, named, remembered. They rose with the sun and were carried in song. They were etched into stone and whispered into ears. And though the empires that worship them may have fallen, though temples may crumble and codices burn, the echo remains, carried in stories, in dust, in you. So tonight, as you drift further into quiet, let that echo settle. Let the footsteps of priests fade behind you. Let the firelight of the great temple dim in your mind. Let the heartbeat of drums slow to a hush. There is nothing more to hold, nothing more to carry. The rites are done. The breath is steady. The night is here. Sleep now beneath the shadow of old suns, while the gods, forgotten or remembered, keep silent watch. Good night.